Let's speak with Dominic Grieve, former chair of that committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee. Mr. Grieve, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
We've spoken many times, and of course you've been urging the government to release this. This wasn't news to you. You already knew what was in this report, of course.
Yes, I did know what was in the report. The report was ready for publication and submitted in the form in which it's just been published to the Prime Minister for approval on the 15th of October last year. I think it was the 15th, it might have been the 16th, but it was mid-October. And it should have been published at the end of that month. And the failure to publish it was deeply regrettable.
Do we know why? I mean, we were speaking with Jack Straw a moment ago, and he was suggesting, as many have, that it was the component within the report that alluded to the fact that Brexit, well, we don't know because our guys weren't looking, but it could be that the Brexit referendum, the EU referendum, might have been interfered with. Would it have been that Mr. Johnson felt that might have diluted his integrity into 2019?
I simply don't know. The report is in the form in which you've seen it. I personally think it was eminently publishable, and if he had a good reason why he didn't want to publish it, then the proper thing to do would have been to call me in as chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee and explain to me what the problem was and why he felt he couldn't do it. But that never happened. Instead, what we got in November last year was and immediately afterwards, a series of explanations that were simply not credible. They weren't worthy of belief, and they couldn't be right. And they were arguments that it normally took 6 weeks. And this is all complete nonsense. So I shall never know exactly why this happened. It may be there was something in the report that they felt they just didn't want prior to an election. Well, that was utterly wrong of them, if that's the case, not to publish it then because of that. That was a party political consideration that should not have come into it. The second one that's been put forward is that because I was by then an independent MP, they didn't want me to have the headlines that might go with the launch of the report. Well, that's a very shallow reason if it's true, but I've no idea if it's true or not.
I mean, one could reasonably argue, based on what we know, and you will have read it in far more detail, of course, because you are, you were part of this whole process, that it's equally as embarrassing to previous governments, not just Mr. Johnson's. I mean, one could put forward the argument that Theresa May's government doesn't come out well out of this either by taking their eye off the ball.
Well, that must be right. Boris Johnson took office in September last year. So most of the content of the report, although there was a period when he was Foreign Secretary, dealt with periods when he was certainly not in charge of government and had nothing to do with him. We took the view that there was a failure in a period in the early 2010 onwards to get a real grip of the threat which Russia posed to our security and ultimately our democratic processes. And more should have been done. But as I've tried to make this point, the report makes the point that the intelligence services, for very understandable reasons, will be most reluctant to get involved in democratic processes unless there is a clear political steer, which is a cross-party steer, that this is now necessary if threats to our democracy are to be prevented.
Did this ever come? I mean, you've sat in cabinet. Did this ever come up? I mean, as far as you can tell us, that that it appears that that's bearing in mind. I mean, the Russians, along with the Chinese, and it's almost a stereotype that they're spying on us. But we know that this is very real, and it turns out that it's far more real than many people would like to have thought about. I mean, what was going on when you were in government, Dominic Grieve? Were you aware of this lack of looking around to see what they were up to?
I think it's a difficult question for me to answer. The existence of a threat from Russia was perfectly well known. After all, the Russians had murdered Mr. Litvinenko in 2006 with polonium in this country. And I think it was probably quite clear that it was also known that they were interfering with our cybersecurity. But that's slightly different from a situation where there may have been a full understanding of the extent to which they would try to use the internet to subvert democracy.
But I mean, in terms of laying blame at Boris Johnson's door, I mean, that's the blame for not releasing the report. I get that. But in terms of what's actually in it, it predates Boris Johnson, of course.
It does indeed. Yes, absolutely. All the more reason why the decision not to publish in November was inexplicable.
Where do you think this goes, Dominic Grieve, now? I mean, I mentioned the same question to the former Foreign Secretary, Mr. Straw, in terms of that relationship between government and the security services. Where specifically were they when all of this was going on? Would they have been saying, look, we're here to help, but nobody's asking us to? Had they been told to take a hands-off approach to what was happening with Russia? Because it appears Russian paw prints were over everything from public relations to charities through to political activism and property, everywhere.
Well, there was certainly plenty of evidence that Russia's paw prints were in a large number of places. And I don't think I can entirely answer the question as to why it wasn't taken more seriously. But whilst it's true that the security service is self-tasking, that's MI5, at the same time, prioritisation is a matter where they will listen carefully to politicians. There's a great deal of emphasis on counter-terrorism and not enough on state actors who might threaten our security.
That, of course, was mentioned in the report. Do you think there are likely to be changes now? I mean, what would the approach be? What would be a reasonable... I mean, do we even worry about using the word diplomatic approach with this? Do we just kick out any connection with Russia from now onwards?
I think we have to be very vigilant. We've made some recommendations of changes, including that the protection of elections and democratic processes should be transferred to the Home Office from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and should be much better focused. I think that we certainly need to call out the occasions when Russia behaves in this way, and I'm glad to see that we're already doing that. And I think we need to just be more aware that there is a threat from Russia, which is at multiple levels. And I don't think we should lose sleep over it, but as a robust democracy, we need to put in place those mechanisms which we need to make sure that they can't succeed.
Dominic Grieve, thank you. He, of course, was former chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, former Attorney General as well. Can I part company slightly on the emphasis on Boris Johnson? Because, OK, he didn't know the answer. Jack Straw didn't know the answer. I, therefore, certainly don't know the answer, and I doubt whether anybody else does, as to why Johnson sat on this report. I mean, the nearest I would get is that some people may well... I haven't seen Comedy Carol on Twitter, although she did block me on Twitter. So I wouldn't have done, I suppose. But often you see via a retweet or anything. I don't know whether she got a bit quiet on the Russian front, because I think she was trying to make all sorts of connections and correlations that didn't quite pan out in the way that her imagined world had suggested. So Boris Johnson might have been worried pre-20... I'm thinking aloud here. So pre-20... When did we have the election? December, wasn't it? So December election, he might have been thinking, if there is something in... Well, he would have seen the report... Is the bit that says we don't know whether Russia interfered in the Brexit election, would that have been damaging enough for some people to say, I'm not going to vote for Boris Johnson because of what happened? I don't think so, somehow. I still can't tell you why he sat on the report, but I will give the overarching point that I mentioned to Dominic Grieve and to Jack Straw then, that actually I think if you're talking the blame game here, then look at Mr. Cameron, look at Theresa May in that respect. And why David Cameron wouldn't have been actively interested in, if we are to assume that the Russians quite like a bit of Brexit, it suits their kind of idea or their geopolitical aspirations for a disrupted West, as Jack Straw put it, then you might think that David Cameron would have been the first to go to the security boys and say, can you have a little look at what's going on? Because we want to make sure this is nice and clean. And there's a lot of momentum behind that Brexit campaign. Maybe the Russians are responsible. By the way, I think that's probably hogwash. But the fact is, and this is a very real point, we don't know.